The whiskey-soaked laughter of the saloon patrons carried across the dusty street of Silver Ridge, Montana territory as 28-year-old Eleanor Hartford stepped down from the stagecoach on that sweltering afternoon in July 1876, her spine straight, despite the exhaustion that clung to every bone in her body after 2 weeks of brutal travel from Boston. She clutched her worn leather satchel containing everything she owned in this world, her sensible gray dress already coated with a fine layer of dust that seemed to settle on everything in this God-forsaken frontier town nestled in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains. "That must be the new Schoolmarm," a woman's voice drifted from the wooden boardwalk, pitched just loud enough for Eleanor to hear every cutting word. "Lord have mercy. She looks every bit the spinster they said she was." Eleanor's jaw tightened, but she kept her eyes forward, scanning the ramshackle buildings that lined the main street. She had heard variations of that particular insult for the past 6 years, ever since she turned 22 without a husband and Boston society began treating her like a curiosity at best, a failure at worst. Her younger sister had married at 19 to a banker's son, while Eleanor had committed the cardinal sin of preferring books to balls, ideas to idle chatter, and independence to the suffocating constraints of being some man's property. "Miss Hartford?" A portly man with thinning hair and a mayor's badge pinned to his vest approached her, or his smile professional, but his eyes assessing her in that way she had grown to recognize, calculating her worth based solely on her unmarried status and fading youth. "Welcome to Silver Ridge. I'm Mayor Thornton. We're mighty grateful you answered our advertisement for a teacher." "Thank you, Mayor," Eleanor replied, her voice clear and educated, another thing that seemed to unsettle people in these parts. "I'm eager to begin my duties. The children here deserve a proper education." Mayor Thornton's smile faltered slightly. "Yes, well, about that. The schoolhouse is modest, and the children are rather, shall we say, rough around the edges. Most of the families here are miners, prospectors, ranchers. They don't put much stock in book learning." "Then it's my job to show them its value," Eleanor said firmly, or refusing to be discouraged before she had even started. She had not traveled 2,000 miles to be intimidated by ignorance. The mayor gestured toward a small building at the far end of town, its white paint peeling and its bell tower listing slightly to one side. "That's the schoolhouse. Your quarters are attached to the back. Nothing fancy, but it's clean. Mrs. Patterson from the general store left you some provisions." As they walked toward her new home, Eleanor became acutely aware of the stares following her progress down the street. Women peered from windows, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright disdain. Men tipped their hats with varying degrees of courtesy, but she caught the whispers, the dismissive glances. She was an outsider, an educated woman without a husband, which made her either pitiable or threatening, depending on who was doing the judging. The schoolhouse was indeed modest, consisting of a single room with rough-hewn benches, a blackboard that had seen better days, and windows that let in almost as much dust as light. Her quarters were smaller still, just enough space for a narrow bed, a washstand, a small stove, and a trunk for her belongings. But it was hers, and that counted for something. That first evening, as Eleanor unpacked her precious books and arranged them on the small shelf above her bed, she heard the sound of heavy boots on the wooden steps outside. She opened the door to find a tall, broad-shouldered man standing in the fading light, his presence so commanding that she took an involuntary step back. He was unlike any man she had ever encountered in Boston. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so wide they seemed to block out the setting sun behind him. His arms, visible beneath the rolled sleeves of his worn shirt, were corded with muscles that spoke of years of hard physical labor. His chest was massive, straining against the fabric, and his hands looked strong enough to snap a branch with no effort. Long, dark hair fell past his shoulders, tied back with a leather cord, and his face was weathered by sun and wind, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days' growth of beard. His eyes, however, were what held her attention, a startling shade of blue-gray that seemed to see right through her carefully constructed defenses. "You're the new teacher," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to resonate in her chest. It was not a question. "I am, Eleanor Hartford." She extended her hand, determined not to show the nervousness that fluttered in her stomach. He looked at her hand for a moment before engulfing it in his own. His palm was calloused and warm, his grip gentle despite the obvious strength behind it. Ezra Blackwood. I've got a cabin up in the high country, but I come down to town for supplies every few weeks. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Blackwood. Eleanor withdrew her hand, noticing that his touch had left her skin tingling in a most peculiar way. Heard the ladies at the Mercantile talking about you, Ezra said, his expression unreadable. Calling you a spinster, saying you'll probably run back east before the first snow. Eleanor's spine stiffened, her chin lifting in defiance. Then they'll be disappointed. You have no intention of running anywhere. Something that might have been respect flickered in those blue-gray eyes. That's good. The children here need someone who won't give up on them. Their last 3 teachers didn't make it past a month. Why is that? Eleanor asked, genuinely curious despite her exhaustion. Because they came here thinking they'd civilize the frontier with their superior Eastern ways, Ezra said bluntly. They looked down on the miners' children, the ranchers' daughters who could rope a calf before they could read. They tried to make everyone fit into their narrow idea of what education should be instead of meeting people where they are. His words struck a chord deep within Eleanor. I assure you, Mr. Blackwood, I have no intention of looking down on anyone. I came here to teach, not to judge. Ezra studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor had the unsettling feeling that he could see past her proper exterior to the lonely, determined woman beneath. We'll see, he finally said. I'd better get going before the light fails completely. Just wanted to drop this off. He held out a cloth-wrapped bundle that Eleanor had not noticed he was carrying. She took it, surprised by its weight, and unwrapped it to find several large trout, freshly caught and cleaned. I can't accept this, she said automatically, years of Boston propriety rising to the surface. You can, and you will, Ezra replied, his tone brooking no argument. You look half-starved from your journey, and there's no sense in wasting good fish. Consider it a welcome gift. Before Eleanor could protest further, he had descended the steps and was walking away, his powerful frame moving with surprising grace for such a large man. She stood in the doorway, holding the fish and watching until he disappeared into the gathering darkness, wondering what had just happened and why her heart was beating faster than it should. The next morning, Eleanor rang the schoolhouse bell at precisely 8 o'clock, its clear tone echoing across the valley. She had spent the early hours preparing lessons, arranging the classroom, and psychologically preparing herself for whatever challenges awaited. She had eaten the trout for breakfast, and despite her initial reluctance to accept charity, it had been the most delicious meal she had eaten in weeks. The children arrived in small clusters, ranging in age from 6 to 15, their faces reflecting various degrees of curiosity, suspicion, and outright hostility. There were 12 of them in total, dressed in patched clothing, their hands already work-roughened, their eyes old beyond their years. These were children who had seen hardship, who had responsibilities that would crush most city children, who had learned early that life on the frontier was brutal and unforgiving. Good morning, Eleanor said, her voice warm but firm. My name is Miss Hartford, and I'm honored to be your teacher. I know you've had several teachers come and go, but I want you to understand something from the very beginning. I'm not here to change who you are or where you come from. I'm here to give you tools, reading, writing, mathematics, history, with science. Tools you can use to build whatever life you choose for yourselves. A boy of about 14, tall and rangy with his father's mining dust still on his clothes, spoke up. Why should we care about books? My pa says reading won't put food on the table or ore in the mine. What's your name? Eleanor asked. Thomas Brennan, the boy replied, his chin jutting out defiantly. Thomas, your father is right that reading alone won't mine ore. But reading will help you understand contracts so you're not cheated when you sell that ore. Mathematics will help you calculate fair prices, keep accurate records, maybe even design more efficient mining equipment. Knowledge is power, Thomas, and I want to give you that power. She saw something shift in the boy's eyes, a spark of interest he tried to hide. Any of the other children were watching her intently now, weighing her words, deciding whether to trust this Eastern stranger who talked differently than their parents. Now, Eleanor continued, I want each of you to tell me your name, how old you are, and one thing you're curious about. It can be anything at all. What followed surprised her. These supposedly rough frontier children had questions about everything from why the sky was blue to how trains worked, from what caused thunder to whether there were really cities as big as they had heard about back east. Their curiosity was raw and untamed, but it was genuine, and Eleanor felt her heart swell with purpose. The morning passed quickly, with Eleanor assessing each child's reading and arithmetic skills. The levels varied wildly. From 6-year-old Molly Patterson, who could barely recognize letters, to 15-year-old Sarah Chen, daughter of a Chinese railroad worker and a Shoshone woman who could read as well as Eleanor herself, but had been overlooked by previous teachers who dismissed her based on her mixed heritage. During the lunch break, Eleanor sat on the schoolhouse steps, eating the simple meal she had prepared, when she noticed a group of women gathering across the street. Their voices carried on the wind, and while she could not make out every word, the tone was clear enough. Disapproval, judgment, speculation. "They're wondering if you'll last," a voice said from behind her. Eleanor turned to find Ezra Blackwood leaning against the corner of the building, his massive arms crossed over his broad chest. He must have approached from the back, while moving with that surprising quiet she had noticed the previous evening. "You seem to appear out of nowhere, Mr. Blackwood," Eleanor said, her heart doing that peculiar flutter again. "Comes from years of tracking game in the mountains," he replied with a slight smile that transformed his rugged face into something almost boyish. "And it's just Ezra. We don't stand much on ceremony out here." "Then you must call me Eleanor," she said, surprising herself with the offer. She had always insisted on maintaining proper distance, but something about this man made her want to break her own rules. Ezra moved to sit beside her on the steps, and Eleanor was acutely aware of his size, his warmth, the way his presence seemed to fill the space around them. He smelled of pine and leather and something wild she could not quite identify. "How was your first morning?" he asked. "Challenging but promising," Eleanor replied honestly. "These children are bright, Ezra, genuinely bright. They just need someone to believe in them." "That's what I told the town council when they were debating whether to even bother hiring another teacher," Ezra said. "Most folks around here think education is a waste of time, especially for girls. They figure boys will work the mines or the ranches and girls will get married, so what's the point?" "That's incredibly short-sighted," Eleanor said, unable to keep the frustration from her voice. "Education opens doors, creates opportunities. Without it, people are trapped, limited by circumstances beyond their control." Ezra turned to look at her, his blue-gray eyes intense. "That's why you came here, isn't it? Not just to teach, but to prove something. To show them that an educated woman has value beyond being someone's wife." His perception startled her into honesty. "In Boston, I was considered a failure because I wasn't married by 22. My own mother could barely look at me without disappointment. My sister's friends pitied me at best, mocked me at worst. I wanted to go somewhere my worth wasn't determined solely by my marital status." "The smartest woman I've ever met was a Blackfoot elder named Many Snows," Ezra said quietly. "She could read the weather in ways that saved lives, knew more about healing plants than any doctor in 100 miles, and could negotiate peace between warring tribes. She never married by choice. Her people honored her for her wisdom, not her reproductive status. White society could learn a lot from that." Eleanor stared at him, this mountain man who spoke of Native American women with respect, who seemed to understand things that most educated men in Boston never grasped. "You're not like the other men in town," she said softly. "I spent more of my life in the high country than in civilization," Ezra replied. "Up there, what matters is whether you can survive, whether you have the skills and knowledge to make it through another winter. Gender doesn't mean much when you're facing down a grizzly or trying to outlast a blizzard. Competence is what counts." "Is that why you came down from your cabin? To see if I was competent?" Eleanor asked, a hint of challenge in her voice. Ezra's smile widened. "Partly, but mostly because I wanted to see the woman who had the whole town talking. They're calling you a spinster schoolmarm like it's an insult, dismissing you before you've had a chance to prove yourself. But I saw something in your eyes last night. Determination, intelligence, strength. You're not someone who gives up easily." "No, I'm not," Eleanor agreed, meeting his gaze directly. "I've fought too hard to be here to let small-minded gossip drive me away." "Good," Ezra said, standing up in one fluid motion despite his size. because I think you might be exactly what this town needs, even if they don't know it yet." He walked away then, and Eleanor watched him go, her mind whirling with thoughts she had no business thinking about a man she had just met. But there was something about Ezra Blackwood that called to her in ways no Boston gentleman ever had, something raw and real and utterly compelling. The afternoon lessons went well, and by the time Eleanor dismissed the children at 3 o'clock, she felt cautiously optimistic about her prospects. She spent the evening preparing the next day's lessons and reading by lamplight, her small room growing cold as the mountain temperature dropped with the setting sun. The following weeks established a rhythm. Eleanor taught from 8 until 3, spent the evenings preparing lessons and grading the simple assignments she gave, and used her Saturdays to explore the town and surrounding area. The children were making progress, especially Sarah Chen, who soaked up knowledge like parched earth absorbing rain. Thomas Brennan had softened his hostility and was showing a real aptitude for mathematics. Even the youngest children were learning their letters and numbers. But the adults remained distant, judgmental. The women barely spoke to her beyond cold pleasantries, and the men either ignored her completely or made inappropriate comments that she had to deflect with icy politeness. She was an outsider, unmarried and educated, which made her suspect on both counts. Ezra, however, became a regular presence. He appeared every few days, always bringing something: fresh meat, vegetables from someone's garden, once a beautiful bearskin to warm her cold floor. He never stayed long, but their conversations ranged from practical matters like how to keep her stove burning efficiently to philosophical discussions about education, society, and the changing West. Eleanor found herself looking forward to his visits with an anticipation that both thrilled and frightened her. She had never felt this way about anyone. This awareness of another person's existence, this hunger for their company and conversation. Ezra treated her as an equal, valued her intelligence, and seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions. He was also, she could not help but notice, extraordinarily attractive in a way that had nothing to do with refined manners or fashionable dress, and everything to do with raw masculine power and competence. One Saturday afternoon in late August, Eleanor was returning from a walk when she encountered a group of women outside the general store. Mrs. Thornton, the mayor's wife, was holding court with 3 other ladies, and their conversation stopped abruptly when Eleanor approached. "Good afternoon, ladies," Eleanor said politely, though she could feel the hostility radiating from the group. "Miss Hartford," Mrs. Thornton acknowledged coldly, "we were just discussing the upcoming church social. It's a family event, of course." The implication was clear. As a spinster without family, Eleanor was not welcome. Before she could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Eleanor's been working herself to exhaustion teaching your children," Ezra said, materializing beside her with 2 large sacks of supplies over his shoulders, his muscular frame making the heavy load look effortless. "Seems like she deserves a bit of socializing and appreciation, not petty exclusion." Mrs. Thornton's face flushed. "Mr. Blackwood, this is hardly your concern." "It is when I see good people being treated poorly for no reason other than ignorant prejudice," Ezra replied, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made the women shift uncomfortably. "Eleanor's the best teacher this town has ever had, and if you had any sense, you'd be grateful instead of spiteful." "She's a spinster," Mrs. Patterson from the Mercantile said, as if this explained everything. "Unmarried at her age, no family, too educated for her own good. It's not natural." "What's not natural is judging someone's worth based on their marital status instead of their character and abilities," Ezra said, his blue-gray eyes hard as flint. "Eleanor chose not to marry some fool who would have wasted her intelligence and treated her like property. That makes her smart, not pitiable. She's the smartest woman here, whether you're willing to admit it or not." The silence that followed was profound. Eleanor felt her throat tighten with emotion, with tears pricking behind her eyes that she refused to let fall. No one had ever defended her like that, had ever stood up to societal judgment on her behalf. Her own family had been embarrassed by her unmarried state, but this mountain man who barely knew her had just proclaimed her intelligence and worth in front of the very people who dismissed her. "Thank you, Ezra," she managed to say, her voice steadier than she felt. He looked down at her, and something passed between them in that moment, something profound and undeniable. "Just speaking the truth," he said softly. The women dispersed quickly after that, shooting disapproving glances over their shoulders. Eleanor and Ezra walked together toward the schoolhouse, neither speaking until they reached her door. "You didn't have to do that," Eleanor said. You've made yourself unpopular with the town ladies." Ezra shrugged his massive shoulders. "I've never been popular with them anyway. I don't fit their idea of what a proper man should be. No wife, no farm or business in town, living up in the mountains like a savage. We're both outsiders, Eleanor, just in different ways." "Yes, we are," Eleanor agreed, studying his face in the afternoon light. "But I think perhaps that's not such a terrible thing." "No, it's not," Ezra said, his eyes holding hers. "The smartest, most interesting people I've known have always been outsiders. People who think differently, who question instead of accepting, who forge their own paths." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, like a door opening that she had kept locked for years. "Would you like to stay for supper?" she asked, on the invitation emerging before she could second-guess herself. "I'm not an excellent cook, but I've learned to manage with limited resources." Ezra's smile was slow and warm. "I'd like that very much." They prepared the meal together in her small quarters, moving around each other in the confined space with surprising ease. Ezra was deft with a knife despite his large hands, chopping vegetables with precision, while Eleanor mixed cornbread batter. They talked about everything and nothing: his life in the mountains, her childhood in Boston, books they had both read, the beauty of the Montana landscape. "How did you end up as a mountain man?" Eleanor asked as they sat down to eat at her small table, their knees nearly touching in the cramped space. "My father was a trapper," Ezra explained. "But my mother was the daughter of a French trader and a Crow woman. I grew up in both worlds, spending winters in St. Louis with my father's family, summers in the mountains with my mother's people. When I was 16, my father was killed by a drunk miner, and my mother died of fever the following winter. I had no place in either world by then, so I went to the one place where I felt I belonged, the high country." "That must have been incredibly lonely," Eleanor said softly. "Sometimes," Ezra admitted, "but also freeing. I didn't have to pretend to be something I wasn't. I could just exist, learn the land, live by my own rules. Over the years, I've guided hunting parties, scouted for the army a few times, trapped during bad winters. I've got a good cabin, game is plentiful, and I'm beholden to no one." "And yet you come down to Silver Ridge regularly," Eleanor observed. "Because complete isolation isn't healthy either," Ezra said, his eyes meeting hers. "And lately, because there's someone here worth making the journey for." Eleanor's breath caught. The air between them seemed charged with possibility, with the weight of things unsaid. "Ezra," she began, but she did not know how to finish. He reached across the table, his large hand covering hers. "I know we barely know each other, Eleanor. I know I'm not the kind of man a woman like you should want. Rough, uneducated in formal ways, more comfortable with bears than ballrooms. But I can't stop thinking about you. Your intelligence, your courage, your determination to make a difference despite how you're treated. You're extraordinary." Eleanor turned her hand over, lacing her fingers through his. "I've spent my entire life being told that my intelligence was unfeminine, that my independence was unnatural, that I needed to diminish myself to be acceptable. You're the first person who has ever valued those things about me, who sees them as strengths rather than flaws. That's extraordinary, too." They sat like that for a long moment, hands clasped, eyes locked, the evening light fading through the small window. Finally, Ezra stood, gently releasing her hand. "I should go. Don't want to damage your reputation any more than I already have." "My reputation is already in tatters according to the good people of Silver Ridge," Eleanor said with a slight smile. "But I understand. Thank you for supper, and for your company." Ezra paused at the door, on turning back to look at her with an intensity that made her pulse race. "Eleanor, I want you to know. What they say about you being a spinster, about being unmarried, meaning you're somehow less than other women. It's all poison. You're not unmarried because no one wanted you. You're unmarried because you were waiting for someone who could meet you as an equal, who could value all of who you are. Don't ever forget that." He left then, disappearing into the night, and Eleanor sat alone in her small room, her hand still warm from his touch, her heart fuller than it had been in years. The incident at the general store had repercussions. Over the following days, Eleanor noticed a slight shift in the town's attitude toward her. Some of the women seemed chastened, while others were even more hostile. But interestingly, a few of the miners and ranchers who had previously ignored her started tipping their hats with genuine respect. Ezra's fierce defense had apparently resonated with some of the men, even if their wives disapproved. The children's education continued to progress. Eleanor introduced geography lessons using maps she had brought from Boston, teaching them about the wider world beyond their mountain valley. She taught science through observation of the natural world around them, taking the class on walks to identify plants and discuss why trees changed color in autumn. She made mathematics relevant by having them calculate real-world problems: how much lumber was needed to build a barn, how to figure mining yields, how to calculate distances for travel. Sarah Chen blossomed under Eleanor's attention, her quick mind absorbing everything. The girl had a particular aptitude for languages, speaking English, Chinese, and Shoshone fluently, and Eleanor began teaching her French from her own university textbooks. Thomas Brennan discovered a passion for engineering and design, spending hours sketching ideas for better mining equipment based on the principles Eleanor taught him. But it was the younger children who captured Eleanor's heart most profoundly. 6-year-old Molly Patterson, who had seemed destined for a life of illiteracy, was reading simple books by September. 8-year-old Billy Chen, Sarah's younger brother, turned out to have a gift for mathematics that astonished even Eleanor. 10-year-old Rebecca Johansson, daughter of Norwegian immigrants, wrote poetry that was surprisingly sophisticated for her age. Ezra visited at least twice a week now, untiming his arrivals for early evening when Eleanor had finished her lesson preparations. They took walks together through the town and surrounding countryside, talking about everything under the vast Montana sky. He told her about the mountains, the wildlife, the changing seasons in the high country. She told him about books she loved, ideas she found fascinating, her dreams of creating real change through education. With each conversation, each shared moment, Eleanor felt herself falling deeper into something she had never expected to experience: genuine, profound love. Ezra was unlike any man she had ever known. His strength was not just physical, though watching him split firewood for her stove or carry heavy supplies with effortless power certainly affected her in ways she had never experienced. His real strength lay in his character, his integrity, his ability to see worth in people that others dismissed. And he looked at her like she was precious, valuable, desired not despite her intelligence, but because of it. When she explained a complex scientific principle, his eyes lit with interest. When she passionately defended an educational philosophy, he listened with genuine attention. When she revealed her fears and insecurities, he offered understanding without judgment. One evening in early October, as they sat on a fallen log watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Eleanor felt Ezra's hand cover hers. "Eleanor, I need to tell you something," he said, his voice low and serious. Her heart stuttered. "What is it?" "I'm falling in love with you," Ezra said simply, turning to face her. "I know it's fast. I know I'm not the kind of man you probably imagine for yourself, but it's the truth. You're the smartest, bravest, most fascinating woman I've ever met, and I can't imagine my life without you in it." Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes, but these were tears of joy, of relief, of coming home to a place she had never known existed. "Ezra, I'm falling in love with you too. I think I have been since that first evening when you brought me fish and didn't treat me like I was something broken or deficient. You see me, really see me, and that's all I've ever wanted." He lifted his free hand to cup her face, his calloused palm gentle against her cheek. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Please," Eleanor whispered. The kiss was everything she had never known to hope for: tender yet passionate, respectful yet hungry. A perfect balance of restraint and desire. His lips were warm and soft despite the roughness of his beard, and when his arms came around her, pulling her close against his massive chest, Eleanor felt safer and more cherished than she ever had in her life. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Ezra rested his forehead against hers. I want to court you properly, he said. I want everyone in this town to know that you're mine and I'm yours, and that we chose each other. I want that too, Eleanor replied, her hands resting on his broad chest, feeling the steady thunder of his heartbeat beneath her palms. But you need to know that I won't give up teaching. I won't give up my independence or my work, even if we're together. I wouldn't want you to, Ezra said firmly. Your teaching is part of who you are. And I love all of who you are. We'll figure out how to make it work. Maybe I'll move closer to town during the school year, or we'll find a way for you to spend summers in the mountains. There's always a solution when two people are committed to each other. Eleanor pulled back to look at him, this extraordinary man who was offering her everything she had never dared to dream of: love, respect, partnership, freedom. How did I get so lucky? She asked softly. I'm the lucky one, Ezra replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I've been alone for so long, Eleanor. I didn't realize how lonely I was until I met you. You've brought light into my life, purpose beyond mere survival. They stayed there until full dark, talking and planning and stealing kisses like the lovers they were becoming. The vast Montana sky spreading stars above them like a benediction. News of their courtship spread through Silver Ridge like wildfire, sparking reactions that ranged from approving to scandalized. Some saw it as romantic, the mountain man and the schoolmarm finding love against the odds. Others, particularly the judgmental women who had dismissed Eleanor as a spinster, saw it as further evidence of her unsuitability, claiming that only a wild man who barely lived in civilization would want such an unnatural woman. Eleanor found that she did not care. For the first time in her life, she was choosing her own path, living according to her own values, and finding happiness in the process. The opinions of people who had never shown her kindness or respect meant nothing compared to the love and acceptance she found in Ezra's arms. Their courtship was unconventional by Eastern standards, but perfectly suited to both of them. Ezra taught Eleanor to ride horseback properly, to shoot a rifle for protection, to read animal tracks and weather signs. Eleanor shared her books with him, and they spent evenings reading aloud to each other, discussing literature and philosophy and current events. They took long walks through the mountains, Ezra showing her hidden valleys and pristine lakes, teaching her the names of plants and animals. He was endlessly patient with her questions, never dismissive or condescending. And she was fascinated by his knowledge, the practical wisdom gained from years of living close to the land. They challenged each other, learned from each other, grew together in ways that felt both exhilarating and deeply natural. The first snow came in mid-October, dusting the mountains white and bringing a sharp chill to the air. Eleanor was standing outside the schoolhouse watching the children play during lunch break when she heard raised voices from the direction of the saloon. A group of men had gathered, and their aggressive postures suggested trouble. Stay here, Eleanor told the children firmly, then walked toward the commotion, her spine straight despite her nervousness. As she approached, she realized the argument was about mining claims, a perennial source of conflict in Silver Ridge. Two miners were facing off, both drunk and belligerent, while their friends tried ineffectually to calm them down. One man had a knife, the other a broken bottle, and violence seemed imminent. "Gentlemen, please," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the chaos with the authority she used to control her classroom. "This is hardly the way to resolve a disagreement." "Stay out of this, Schoolmarm," one of the men slurred. "This is men's business." "This is foolish business," Eleanor corrected sharply. "You're about to kill each other over a claim dispute that could be settled legally. Do you have your claim papers?" The men stared at her in drunken confusion. "Papers?" one finally said. "Yes, papers. Documentation of your claims filed with the territorial office. That's how ownership disputes are supposed to be resolved." Eleanor held out her hand. "Let me see them." To her surprise, both men fumbled in their pockets and produced crumpled documents. Eleanor took them, quickly scanning the official language, and realized the issue immediately. "You're not even fighting over the same claim," she said, exasperated. "Your claims are on opposite sides of the creek, Mr. Jenkins. You're on the north bank. Mr. Riley is on the south. There's no overlap." The men blinked at her, then at each other, then at their respective claims. The tension dissolved into embarrassed laughter as they realized they had nearly killed each other over a misunderstanding born of poor literacy and excessive alcohol. "Miss Hartford's right," Mr. Jenkins said, shaking his head. "Damn, I'm sorry, Riley. I thought you were trying to jump my claim. And I thought you were encroaching on mine, Riley admitted. Guess we both need to learn to read better. The crowd dispersed, crisis averted, but Eleanor was shaking with delayed reaction. Odd she had just walked into a potentially deadly situation armed with nothing but education and boldness, and it had worked, but it could have gone very differently. That was brave and incredibly foolish, Ezra's voice said from behind her, and she turned to find him standing there, his face a mixture of admiration and anger. They could have hurt you, Eleanor. Someone had to do something, Eleanor said defensively. They were about to kill each other. So you thought you'd just walk into the middle of two drunk men with weapons? Ezra grabbed her shoulders, not roughly but firmly enough to convey his distress. God, Eleanor, you could have been stabbed or slashed or... But I wasn't, Eleanor interrupted. And now those two men are alive and friends again, instead of one being dead and the other being hanged for murder. That's worth the risk. Ezra pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his massive chest. You're the bravest woman I know, he said into her hair. But you're also going to give me gray hairs before my time. Please, please be more careful. Eleanor softened, wrapping her arms around his waist as much as she could given his size. I'll try, she promised. But I can't stand by when I have the ability to help, Ezra. It's not in my nature. I know, he murmured. It's one of the things I love most about you. But I need you safe, Eleanor. I need you alive and whole and with me. They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other in the middle of the street, and Eleanor felt the watching eyes of the town on them. But she also felt something shifting, a grudging respect from some quarters, on a recognition that perhaps the spinster schoolmarm had more steel in her spine than they had given her credit for. That evening, Mayor Thornton came to the schoolhouse with an unusual request. Miss Hartford, several of the minors asked if you'd be willing to teach an evening reading class. Nothing fancy, just basic literacy. They're willing to pay. Eleanor's heart swelled. I'd be happy to teach them, and there's no need for payment. Education should be available to everyone who wants it. That's generous of you, the mayor said, and for the first time, there was genuine warmth in his voice. What you did today, stopping that fight, people noticed. You've got more courage than most men in this town. After he left, Eleanor sat at her small table, overwhelmed by the realization that she was finally making a real difference, finally proving that an educated woman had value beyond her marital status. She was changing minds, opening doors, creating opportunities not just for children, but for adults who had been denied education by circumstance and poverty. When Ezra arrived an hour later, she told him about the mayor's visit and the evening classes. His smile was brilliant. I'm so proud of you, he said, pulling her into his arms. You're transforming this whole town. We're transforming it, Eleanor corrected. Your defense of me gave me credibility. Your respect for education by example showed others it was valuable. We're partners in this, Ezra. Partners, Ezra repeated, his blue-gray eyes intense. I like the sound of that. Partners in everything, Eleanor, in work, in life, in love. He kissed her then, slow and deep and full of promise, and Eleanor felt desire kindle in her belly, hot and demanding. She had never felt physical desire before, had thought herself perhaps lacking in that particular area, but Ezra's touch awakened something fierce and primal within her. She wanted him, wanted his hands on her body, wanted to feel his weight pressing her down, wanted all of him in ways that would have scandalized her Boston family. Eleanor, Ezra groaned against her mouth, his large hands gripping her waist. We need to stop or I won't be able to stop. Then marry me, Eleanor said boldly, pulling back to look at him. Marry me, Ezra. I don't want to wait, don't want to follow some arbitrary timeline of what courtship should look like. I know what I want, and it's you, all of you, forever. Ezra stared at her, his chest heaving. Are you sure? You haven't seen where I live, haven't experienced a mountain winter, haven't... I'm sure, Eleanor interrupted firmly. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I love you, Ezra Blackwood. I love your strength and your kindness and your respect for who I am. I love how you see the world, how you value knowledge regardless of its source, how you treat people with dignity whether they're wealthy townspeople or poor miners or native women living in the mountains. I want to build a life with you, whatever that looks like, wherever that takes us. Ezra's eyes glistened with moisture. I love you too, Eleanor Hartford, more than I have words to express. Yes, I'll marry you. Tomorrow, next week, whenever you want. I just want you to be my wife." "Tomorrow, then," Eleanor said, laughing through her own tears. "Geez, let's scandalize the town one more time by having a rushed wedding. They already think I'm strange and you're wild, so let's prove them right." They spent the rest of the evening planning, giddy with love and excitement and the sheer audacity of what they were doing. They would marry at the small church with whatever witnesses they could gather, have a simple ceremony, and begin their life together immediately. Eleanor would continue teaching through the school year, and they would figure out their living situation as they went. The wedding took place the next afternoon before a small gathering of surprised townspeople, shocked children, and a beaming minister, who seemed delighted to unite such an unusual couple. Eleanor wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes. Ezra wore clean buckskins and a white shirt that strained across his massive shoulders, his long dark hair tied back, his face shaved clean for the first time since Eleanor had met him. Sarah Chen had woven wildflowers into a crown for Eleanor's hair, a gesture that brought tears to the bride's eyes. Thomas Brennan stood awkwardly on Ezra's side, having been drafted as a witness along with the general store owner, Mr. Patterson, who had apparently developed a grudging respect for Eleanor after she had broken up the mining dispute. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, and Eleanor's attention focused entirely on Ezra, on his blue-gray eyes that held hers with such love and promise that her heart felt too full for her chest. The vows were traditional, but when Eleanor promised to love, honor, and cherish, she meant every word with a depth of commitment she had never imagined herself capable of. And when Ezra's deep voice rumbled through his own vows, his large hands holding hers with exquisite gentleness, Eleanor knew she was binding herself to a man who would honor those promises for the rest of their lives. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister concluded. "Ezra, you may kiss your bride." Ezra's kiss was tender and reverent, mindful of their audience, but still conveying the depth of his love. When they turned to face the gathered townspeople as Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood, Eleanor saw expressions ranging from approval to confusion to outright disapproval, but she found that none of it mattered. She had married the man she loved, the man who valued her for exactly who she was, and nothing else signified. The children cheered and threw handfuls of grain, and several of the miners clapped Ezra on the back with rough congratulations. Mrs. Patterson surprised Eleanor by pressing a beautifully embroidered cloth into her hands. "For your table," she said quietly. "Every bride should have something pretty in her home." That night, Eleanor closed the schoolhouse early and walked with Ezra to his cabin in the mountains. It was a 3-hour journey on horseback, climbing steadily through pine forests and across crystal streams, the autumn air crisp and clean. Ezra kept his horse close to hers, pointing out landmarks, telling her about the terrain, his hand occasionally reaching out to steady her or simply touch her, as if reassuring himself that she was real. The cabin appeared as they crested a ridge, and Eleanor caught her breath. And it was larger than she had expected, built from massive logs with a stone chimney and a wide porch that overlooked a stunning valley. Mountains rose on all sides, their peaks already white with snow, and the setting sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber. "It's beautiful," Eleanor breathed. "It's yours now, too," Ezra said, dismounting and then lifting her down from her horse with easy strength. "Everything I have is yours, Eleanor. This cabin, the land, my heart, my life, all of it." He carried her over the threshold, and Eleanor laughed at the traditional gesture coming from her untamed mountain man. Inside, the cabin was surprisingly comfortable, with a large stone fireplace, handmade furniture that showed real craftsmanship. Shelves lined with books that surprised her until she remembered his mixed heritage and varied education, and windows that framed the spectacular views. "You have books," Eleanor said in delight, moving to examine the collection. She found works of philosophy, natural history, poetry, even novels by authors she loved. "My mother believed in education as strongly as you do," Ezra said, lighting lamps against the gathering darkness. "She made sure I could read and think and question. These books are all that's left of her now." Eleanor turned to him, seeing the grief he still carried for his parents, the loneliness he had endured for so long. "You're not alone anymore," she said softly. "You have me now, Ezra. Always." He crossed the room in 3 long strides, pulling her into his arms. "Eleanor," he murmured against her hair. My wife. I still can't quite believe you're real, that you chose me." "I'll spend the rest of my life proving it to you," Eleanor promised, tilting her face up for his kiss. What followed was tentative at first, both of them nervous despite their love. Eleanor had only the vaguest understanding of what marriage entailed physically, and while Ezra was more experienced, he was also acutely aware of her innocence and desperate not to frighten or hurt her. But love and desire proved excellent teachers. Ezra's large hands were infinitely gentle as he helped her out of her dress, his eyes reverent as he took in her body for the first time. Eleanor trembled, but not from fear, from anticipation, from need, from a hunger she had never known she possessed. "You're so beautiful," Ezra whispered, his fingers tracing the curve of her face. For her throat, lower. "So perfect, Eleanor." When he finally carried her to the large bed in the corner and joined their bodies, Eleanor gasped at the intrusion, the strangeness, but also at the profound intimacy of being joined with the man she loved. Ezra moved slowly, carefully, watching her face for any sign of distress, and gradually pleasure began to build, washing away discomfort and leaving only connection, love, and a building tension that finally crested in waves of sensation that left Eleanor crying out his name. Afterward, they lay tangled together, Ezra's massive body curled protectively around her smaller frame, both breathing hard. "Are you all right?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "I'm better than all right," Eleanor replied, turning in his arms to kiss him. "I'm happy, Ezra. Truly, completely happy." They made love twice more that night, learning each other's bodies, discovering what brought pleasure, building the physical vocabulary of their marriage, and in between, they talked, sharing stories and dreams and fears, cementing the emotional bond that was already so strong. As Eleanor drifted toward sleep in her husband's arms, listening to the wind in the pines outside and the steady beat of Ezra's heart beneath her ear, she marveled at how dramatically her life had changed in just a few short months. She had come to Silver Ridge as a dismissed spinster, considered worthless by society's standards, and had found not just purpose, but profound love with a man who valued everything about her that others had deemed deficient. The next weeks established a new pattern. Eleanor would rise before dawn and ride down to town with Ezra, teach her regular classes and the evening literacy sessions that had become increasingly popular among the miners, then ride back up to the cabin with her husband as darkness fell. It was exhausting but exhilarating, and Eleanor had never felt so alive. The children continued to thrive under her instruction. Sarah Chen was now reading texts that would challenge many university students, and Eleanor had begun seriously discussing the possibility of the girl attending college back east, though she knew such an opportunity would face enormous obstacles given Sarah's mixed heritage. Thomas Brennan had designed several modifications to mining equipment that his father was actually implementing with remarkable success. The evening literacy classes were transforming lives too. Men who had spent years being cheated on contracts because they could not read were learning to protect themselves. Fathers who had been unable to help their children with schoolwork could now participate in their education. The whole town seemed to be opening up, possibilities expanding, and Eleanor was at the center of it all. But not everyone was pleased with the changes. There remained a core group of women, led by Mrs. Thornton, who resented Eleanor's success and influence. They particularly despised her marriage to Ezra, seeing it as further evidence of her unsuitability for polite society. The whispers continued, the snide comments, the subtle exclusions. Eleanor was working late at the schoolhouse one evening in early November, grading papers while waiting for Ezra to finish gathering supplies. When the door opened and Mrs. Thornton entered with 2 other women Eleanor recognized as Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Riley. "Mrs. Blackwood," Mrs. Thornton said, her voice dripping false sweetness, "we need to have a conversation about the appropriateness of your evening literacy classes." Eleanor set down her pen, her spine straightening. "What about them concerns you?" "You're teaching grown men, alone, after dark," Mrs. Patterson said, her face pinched with disapproval. "It's improper, especially for a married woman. What must your husband think?" "My husband thinks it's wonderful that I'm helping people improve their lives through education," Eleanor replied evenly. He fully supports my work." "Of course he does," Mrs. Riley sneered. "He's barely civilized himself, living up in those mountains like an animal. What kind of marriage can you possibly have, Mrs. Blackwood? He's gone for days at a time. You're down here teaching instead of keeping a proper home. It's unnatural." Eleanor felt anger rising but kept her voice calm. "My marriage is none of your concern. And I find it fascinating that you criticize me for teaching, for using my education to help this community, while you sit in your parlors gossiping and contributing nothing." Mrs. Thornton's face flushed red. "How dare you? We are respectable women, pillars of this community. You're nothing but a spinster who got lucky enough to trap a mountain man into marriage. You think you're better than us with your fancy education and your Boston manners, but everyone knows the truth." "And what truth is that?" Eleanor asked, her voice cold. "That you're a fraud," Mrs. Thornton spat. "That you're not a real woman because you care more about books than babies, more about teaching than keeping a proper home. That you've corrupted our children with your progressive ideas and your disrespect for natural gender roles. That you and your savage husband are a disgrace to decent society." The words hung in the air, ugly and hateful, and Eleanor felt something inside her snap. She stood up, drawing herself to her full height, and fixed the three women with a stare that would have done credit to any Boston matriarch. "Get out," she said quietly, each word distinct. "Get out of my schoolhouse right now, and don't come back unless you're here to learn instead of to spew your ignorant venom." "Your schoolhouse?" Mrs. Thornton laughed shrilly. "This building belongs to the town, and the town council will hear about your insolence. We'll have you removed from your position, you and your books and your unnatural ideas." "You can try," Eleanor said, her voice still dangerously calm, "but you'll find that the men whose lives I've improved, the children whose futures I've opened, and the families who have benefited from my teaching will have something to say about it. You represent the old guard, Mrs. Thornton, the fearful and small-minded who think keeping people ignorant is the same as keeping them safe. But change is coming whether you like it or not, and I'm proud to be part of it." The women left in a flurry of scandalized huffs and threats, and Eleanor sank back into her chair, shaking with reaction. She was still sitting there when Ezra arrived 15 minutes later. You're taking one look at her face and immediately crouching beside her chair. "What happened?" he asked, his large hands cupping her face. Eleanor told him everything, her voice breaking occasionally as the hurt beneath the anger surfaced. "They called you a savage," she finished, tears streaming down her cheeks. "They called our marriage unnatural. They want to take away my position, my work, everything I've built here." Ezra pulled her into his arms, holding her tight while she cried. "Let them try," he said, his voice a low rumble of fury. "They're terrified of you, Eleanor, because you represent everything they're not, educated, independent, strong enough to make your own choices. They attack what threatens them, but they won't win. I promise you they won't win." "What if they do?" Eleanor whispered against his chest. "What if the town council sides with them?" "Then we'll fight," Ezra said simply. "We'll go to the territorial governor if we have to. We'll make so much noise that they can't ignore the good you're doing. And if it comes to it, if they force you out, then we'll leave and find somewhere that deserves you. But I don't think it will come to that, Eleanor. You've changed too many lives here. People will stand up for you." He was right. The next day, word of the confrontation had spread through Silver Ridge like wildfire, and the town began to divide into camps. The progressive element, minors whose literacy had saved them from being cheated, fathers who could now read to their children, businessmen who recognized the economic value of an educated workforce, rallied to Eleanor's defense. The conservative element, led by the disapproving women and their husbands who feared female independence, demanded her removal. The town council called an emergency meeting for the following Saturday evening to address the situation. Eleanor arrived with Ezra at her side, his imposing presence a comfort and a statement. The small meeting hall was packed, standing room only, with emotions running high. Mayor Thornton called the meeting to order, his expression troubled. "We're here to discuss the position of Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood as schoolteacher and her evening literacy program. There have been complaints about impropriety and concerns about her influence on our children." Mrs. Thornton immediately stood up. "My husband may be presiding, but I'm going to speak plainly. Mrs. Blackwood is unsuitable for her position. She promotes unnatural ideas about women's roles. She teaches our children to question authority, and her conduct is improper for a married woman. I move that we terminate her employment immediately." A murmur ran through the crowd, some agreeing, others protesting. Then Thomas Brennan stood up, his young face set with determination. "Mrs. Blackwood is the best teacher this town has ever had," he said clearly. "She taught me mathematics and engineering principles that have already improved my father's mining operation. She treated me with respect when previous teachers dismissed me as stupid. She's changed my life, and I'm not the only one." Sarah Chen stood next, her mixed heritage apparent in her features, her intelligence evident in her bearing. "Mrs. Blackwood is the first teacher who didn't treat me like I was less than human, because my mother was Shoshone and my father Chinese. She saw my potential and encouraged me to pursue education beyond what anyone thought possible for someone like me. She represents the best of what teaching should be." One by one, people stood to testify. Miners who could now read contracts, parents whose children were thriving, businessmen who saw the economic benefits of literacy. Even Mr. Patterson from the general store stood up, his face red with emotion. "My wife and Mrs. Thornton and their friends have been poisoning the well against Mrs. Blackwood since she arrived," he said bluntly. "Not because she's done anything wrong, but because she threatens their comfortable prejudices. She's a better teacher and a better person than most of us deserve. And if this council terminates her position, I'll personally fund a private school with her as the sole instructor." The tide had clearly turned, and Mayor Thornton, reading the room, looked at his wife with an expression that mixed apology and resignation. "I think it's clear that Mrs. Blackwood has strong support in this community. Unless there is actual evidence of wrongdoing, which no one has presented, I see no cause for termination." Mrs. Thornton's face turned purple with rage, but before she could speak, Ezra stood up, his massive frame commanding immediate attention. "I want to say something," he said, his deep voice carrying easily through the crowded room. "My wife is the smartest, bravest, most dedicated person I know. She came to this town when no one else wanted to, has worked tirelessly to improve lives, and has asked for nothing but the opportunity to teach. The people attacking her are doing so not because of any real failing on her part, but because she doesn't fit their narrow definition of what a woman should be. Well, I'm grateful for that. If women were all like Mrs. Thornton and her friends, small-minded, judgmental, threatened by intelligence and independence, this world would be a poorer place. Eleanor is extraordinary precisely because she refuses to diminish herself to make others comfortable. This town should be thanking her, not attacking her." The room erupted in applause, drowning out the protests from Mrs. Thornton's faction. The vote, when it came, was decisive. Eleanor would keep her position, and the evening literacy classes would continue with official town support. As they left the meeting hall, Eleanor was surrounded by well-wishers, people thanking her, children hugging her, parents shaking her hand. She felt Ezra's arm around her waist, solid and supportive, and knew that this was victory, real and hard-won. That night, back in their mountain cabin, Ezra made love to his wife with a fierce tenderness that left them both breathless. "I'm so proud of you," he murmured against her throat. "You fought for what you believed in and won." "We won," Eleanor corrected, her hands tracing the powerful muscles of his back. "I couldn't have done it without you, Ezra. Your support, your belief in me, that's what gave me strength." "We're partners," Ezra said, echoing her earlier words. "In everything, Eleanor, always." The winter that followed was both challenging and magical. The mountain passes became impassable by late November, and Eleanor had to move back to her small quarters attached to the schoolhouse for the duration. Ezra came down from the mountains as often as weather permitted, and on the weekends, when the trail was clear, Eleanor made the journey up to the cabin. Their separation was difficult, but also made their reunions intensely sweet. Eleanor found herself living for those moments when she would hear Ezra's boots on the schoolhouse steps, when she could fly into his arms and feel his strength surrounding her. Their lovemaking grew even more passionate, as if they were trying to store up connection against the days apart. The children's education continued to advance. Eleanor introduced more complex subjects, basic chemistry using household substances, advanced mathematics for the older students, literature that exposed them to ideas and cultures beyond their mountain valley. She started a small lending library using her own books and donations from families who had books they were willing to share. The evening literacy classes had grown to include nearly 30 men and even a handful of women who were brave enough to defy social convention and admit they wanted to learn. Eleanor taught basic reading and writing, but also practical mathematics, bookkeeping, even some basic law so people could understand their rights and responsibilities. By spring, when the passes reopened and life returned to normal patterns, Silver Ridge was a noticeably different town. There was more reading, more discussion of ideas, more questioning of assumptions. The changes were not universally welcomed. Mrs. Thornton and her circle remained hostile, but they were undeniable. In April, Eleanor realized she had missed her monthly courses for the second time. At first, she attributed it to stress and the physical demands of her schedule, but when morning nausea began and her breasts became tender, she could no longer deny the truth. She was pregnant. The realization filled her with a complex mix of emotions. Joy at the thought of having Ezra's child, of creating a family with the man she loved. But also fear about how pregnancy and motherhood would affect her teaching, her independence, her identity. She had fought so hard to be valued for more than her reproductive capacity, and now that capacity was asserting itself in the most undeniable way. She told Ezra on a Sunday afternoon as they sat on the cabin porch, the spring sun warm on their faces. "I'm going to have a baby," she said simply, watching his face for his reaction. Ezra's eyes widened, and then he broke into the most brilliant smile Eleanor had ever seen. "A baby," he breathed. "Eleanor, we're going to have a baby." He pulled her into his arms, holding her with exquisite gentleness, as if she had suddenly become fragile. "This is wonderful news," he said against her hair. "You're happy about this, aren't you?" "I am," Eleanor assured him, "but I'm also worried. What about my teaching? What about the evening classes? I can't just stop, Ezra. This work is too important." "You won't have to stop," Ezra said firmly. "Women have been working while pregnant since the beginning of time. You'll teach as long as you're comfortable. And then we'll figure out arrangements for after the baby comes. Maybe Sarah Chen could serve as your assistant. She's certainly capable. Or we could find someone to help with the baby so you can continue teaching part-time." "There are solutions, Eleanor. Having a child doesn't mean abandoning everything else you care about." His understanding, his immediate support, his refusal to assume that motherhood would or should eclipse her other roles, it all made Eleanor love him even more fiercely than she already did. "You're an extraordinary man, Ezra Blackwood," she said, kissing him deeply. "I'm just a man who loves his extraordinary wife," Ezra replied, "and who wants her to be happy, fulfilled, living the life she chooses. If that life includes teaching and motherhood, then we'll make it work." They did make it work, though not without challenges. Eleanor continued teaching through the summer, and when school resumed in September, she was 7 months pregnant and still standing at the front of her classroom. Some people were scandalized by a visibly pregnant woman teaching children, but the majority of families supported her, recognizing that her condition did not diminish her abilities or dedication. Sarah Chen, now 16 and accomplished beyond her years, became Eleanor's official assistant, helping with the younger children and even teaching some of the literacy classes. Eleanor paid her from her own salary, knowing the girl's family needed the income and that Sarah deserved compensation for her valuable work. In late October 1877, during the first heavy snowstorm of the season, Eleanor went into labor. Ezra had been staying in town for the past 2 weeks, unwilling to be far from his wife as her time approached, and when her pains began, he sent for the midwife and held Eleanor's hand through the long hours of labor. Their son was born just after dawn, his lusty cries filling the small room. Ezra cut the cord with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his wife and child. "He's perfect," he whispered. "Eleanor, you're amazing. He's perfect." They named him Daniel, after Eleanor's father, who had been the one person in her Boston family to support her decision to go west, and Robert, after Ezra's father. Daniel Robert Blackwood entered the world weighing 7 pounds, with a shock of dark hair and his father's blue-gray eyes. Eleanor had expected to be overwhelmed by motherhood, but instead, she found it surprisingly manageable. She took 3 weeks off from teaching to recover and bond with her son, and then returned to the classroom with Daniel in a cradle beside her desk. When he needed to nurse, she took a break. When he slept, she taught. The children were fascinated by the baby, treating him like a class mascot, and Eleanor discovered that motherhood and teaching complemented each other rather than competing. Ezra was a devoted father, his massive hands cradling their tiny son with infinite gentleness. He took over much of the household work, cooking and cleaning so Eleanor could focus on Daniel and her teaching. On weekends, they brought the baby up to the cabin, and Ezra would carry Daniel in a sling against his broad chest while doing his outdoor work, talking to his son about the mountains and wildlife and the world they would explore together. The years that followed brought more changes. Silver Ridge grew and prospered, benefiting from the increased literacy and education Eleanor had championed. A proper schoolhouse was built, with separate classrooms and housing for the teacher. The evening literacy program expanded to include more advanced classes, and Sarah Chen eventually took over much of that work, becoming a teacher in her own right despite the obstacles her heritage presented. Eleanor and Ezra had 2 more children, a daughter named Margaret born in 1879 and another son named Samuel born in 1882. Their home became the cabin in the mountains, which Ezra expanded to accommodate their growing family. Eleanor continued to teach, though she reduced her hours during the school year and took summers off to be with her children. The balance was not always easy. There were times when Eleanor felt torn between her roles, guilty when teaching took her away from her children, guilty when family obligations interfered with her work. But Ezra was steadfast in his support, as were her students and their families, who recognized that Eleanor's dedication to education was part of what made her such an excellent mother. She was modeling for her children and theirs that women could be complex, multifaceted people with multiple important roles. Mrs. Thornton and her circle never fully accepted Eleanor, but their influence waned as the town evolved. New families moved to Silver Ridge, drawn by the mining opportunities and the growing reputation of its excellent school. These newcomers had no investment in the old prejudices and judged Eleanor by her accomplishments rather than her failure to conform to traditional expectations. By 1885, when Daniel was 7, Margaret 6, and Samuel 3, Eleanor's transformation of Silver Ridge was complete. The town had the highest literacy rate in Montana Territory, and students who graduated from Eleanor's school were sought after for their strong education. Several had gone on to university, including Sarah Chen, who earned a teaching degree from a progressive college in California before returning to Silver Ridge to teach alongside Eleanor. On a warm summer evening, Eleanor sat on the cabin porch with Ezra, watching their children play in the meadow below. Daniel was teaching Margaret to identify bird calls, while Samuel toddled after butterflies with determined concentration. "Do you ever regret it?" Ezra asked, his arm around Eleanor's shoulders. "Giving up Boston? Coming out here? Choosing this life?" Eleanor turned to look at her husband, this extraordinary man who had seen her worth when others dismissed her, who had defended her intelligence and championed her dreams, who had built a life with her based on mutual respect and profound love. "Not for a single moment," she said truthfully. "Coming here, meeting you, building this life and this family, it's been better than anything I could have imagined back in Boston." "They called you a spinster schoolmarm like it was an insult," Ezra said, echoing the words he had spoken years earlier. "But you were the smartest woman there, the bravest, the most capable. And you still are." "We make a good team," Eleanor replied, kissing him softly. "The mountain man and the schoolmarm. Who would have thought?" "Anyone who bothered to look past surfaces and see the truth," Ezra said. "That intelligence and courage and dedication matter more than conventional expectations. That love can be found in the most unexpected places. The 2 people who don't fit society's molds can build something beautiful together." Their children's laughter drifted up from the meadow, mixing with the sound of wind in the pines and the distant call of an eagle. Eleanor leaned against her husband's solid warmth and felt profound gratitude for this life she had chosen, for the man who had chosen her in return, for the family they had created, and for the difference they had made in their corner of the world. She had come to Silver Ridge as a dismissed spinster, considered worthless by those who could not see beyond her unmarried status. But she had found purpose, love, family, and the satisfaction of knowing she had changed lives through education. She had proven that a woman's worth was not determined by her marital status, but by her character, her abilities, and her contributions to the world around her. And most importantly, she had found a partner who valued all of her intelligence, her ambition, her dedication to teaching, her capacity for love. Ezra had never asked her to be less than she was, had never tried to diminish her to make himself feel larger. Instead, he had celebrated her strengths, supported her goals, and built a life where both of them could thrive as individuals and as a couple. As the sun set over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Eleanor Blackwood felt complete contentment. This was home. This was love. This was the life she had been meant to live, and she would not have changed a single moment of the journey that had brought her here. The years continued to pass, bringing their share of joys and challenges. Daniel grew into a thoughtful young man with his father's strength and his mother's intellectual curiosity. He wanted to be an engineer, designing bridges and buildings that would stand the test of time. Margaret inherited Eleanor's passion for teaching and her father's love of nature, spending hours exploring the mountains and documenting the plants and animals she found. Samuel was still young, but he showed signs of combining his parents' traits, strong and physical like his father, but with a quick mind and love of books like his mother. Eleanor expanded her teaching to include more advanced subjects as her original students grew older and new children entered her classroom. She wrote articles about frontier education that were published in Eastern journals, challenging assumptions about the supposed intellectual inferiority of Western children. Her reputation grew beyond Silver Ridge, and she was invited to speak at educational conferences, though she rarely accepted, preferring to stay close to her family and her work. Ezra continued to guide hunting parties and scout for various enterprises, but he spent more time in Silver Ridge as the children grew older. He built a small workshop where he crafted furniture and tools, his skilled hands creating beautiful and functional pieces that were sought after throughout the territory. He also began teaching wilderness survival skills to the older students, giving them knowledge that could save their lives in the unforgiving frontier environment. Their marriage remained passionate and deep, built on a foundation of respect, shared values, and genuine friendship. They still had disagreements occasionally, Eleanor's stubborn determination sometimes clashing with Ezra's protective instincts, his solitary nature sometimes conflicting with her social obligations, but they had learned to communicate openly and compromise when necessary. The physical attraction that had always existed between them never faded, and even after years of marriage, Ezra could make Eleanor's heart race with a look, a touch, a whispered word. In 1890, when Montana achieved statehood, Silver Ridge celebrated with a grand festival. Eleanor was invited to give a speech about the town's transformation over the past 14 years. She stood on a platform in the town square, her 3 children watching with pride, her husband standing tall and strong beside her, and addressed the crowd that had gathered. When I came to Silver Ridge in 1876, I was dismissed as a spinster schoolmarm, someone past her prime, unmarried and therefore pitiable or deficient. But I found something here that I never found in Boston, the opportunity to prove my worth through my actions rather than my marital status. I found children hungry for knowledge, adults willing to learn, and a community that, despite initial resistance, ultimately valued education and growth. She paused, looking out at the familiar faces, former students now grown with children of their own, minors who had learned to read in her evening classes and used that skill to better their lives, families who had supported her through challenges and celebrated her successes. More importantly, I found love. A man who valued me for my intelligence rather than despite it, who saw my independence as strength rather than deficiency, who built a life with me based on partnership and mutual respect. My husband once told a group of women who were dismissing me as a spinster that I was the smartest woman here. He defended my worth when others attacked it, believed in me when others doubted, and loved me when others found me unlovable. That changed everything. Eleanor reached for Ezra's hand and he took it, his grip strong and sure. Together, We've built a family, contributed to this community, and proven that love can be found in the most unexpected places. We've shown that conventional expectations are not the only path to happiness, that people who don't fit society's molds can still build beautiful, meaningful lives. She looked at her children. Daniel, now 13 and nearly as tall as his father. Margaret, 11 and vibrant with curiosity. Samuel, 8 and adventurous. We've raised children who know that intelligence is valuable, that education opens doors, that strength comes in many forms. We've contributed to a community that values learning and growth, and we've created a partnership that has weathered challenges and celebrated triumphs in equal measure. The crowd erupted in applause, and Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. This was vindication, validation, pre-recognition that the path she had chosen, the unconventional, difficult, often lonely path of an educated, independent woman, had been worth every challenge. That evening, after the festivities had concluded and the children were asleep in their beds, Eleanor and Ezra sat together on their cabin porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. "Do you remember the first time we met?" Eleanor asked, her head resting on Ezra's shoulder. "You were unpacking books and looking exhausted but determined," Ezra replied. "I brought you fish and wondered if you'd survive your first week. And I wondered who this enormous mountain man was and why he was being kind to me when everyone else was judging me," Eleanor added. "I never imagined then that you would become my husband, my partner, the love of my life." "I knew," Ezra said softly. "Not that first night, but soon after. I knew you were extraordinary, that you were exactly what this place needed, that I wanted you in my life in every possible way." Eleanor tilted her face up for his kiss, and it was as sweet and full of promise as their first kiss had been all those years ago. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me, for valuing me, for loving me, for defending me when others dismissed me, for building this life with me." "Thank you for choosing me," Ezra replied, "for loving a rough mountain man who didn't fit society's expectations any more than you did, for building a family and a life that's better than anything I imagined possible, for being exactly who you are, Eleanor, and never apologizing for it." They sat together as the night deepened, two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built something lasting and true from their unconventional beginning. The spinster schoolmarm and the mountain man, dismissed by society but finding in each other everything they needed: love, respect, partnership, and a lifetime of shared adventures. The future stretched before them, full of possibilities. Their children would grow and make their own paths, carrying with them the lessons their parents had taught about valuing intelligence, respecting independence, and choosing love over convention. Silver Ridge would continue to grow and change, shaped in part by the educational foundation Eleanor had built. And Eleanor and Ezra would continue their journey together, partners in every sense, proof that the best love stories are written by those brave enough to defy expectations and follow their hearts. As the moon rose over the mountains, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From dismissed spinster in Boston to respected teacher, wife, mother, and pillar of her community in Montana. She had been called a spinster schoolmarm as if it were an insult, but she had turned that dismissal into triumph. She had proven that intelligence and education were assets, not liabilities. She had found a man who valued her for exactly who she was, and she had built a life of purpose, love, and profound satisfaction. The Wild West had given her what refined Boston never could: the freedom to be fully herself, the opportunity to make a real difference, and a love that honored all of who she was. And as Ezra's arms tightened around her and his lips brushed her temple in a gesture of love and protection that still made her heart flutter after all these years, Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice. She was no longer the dismissed spinster, the pitiful unmarried woman, the failure by society's standards. She was Eleanor Blackwood, teacher, wife, mother, pioneer, beloved. She was the woman who had transformed a frontier town through education. She was the woman who had proven that intelligence was power. She was the woman who had found true love with a mountain man who saw her worth when others were blind to it. And most importantly, she was happy. truly, completely, profoundly happy in ways that had nothing to do with societal approval and everything to do with living authentically, loving deeply, and making a difference in the world around her. The journey from dismissed spinster to cherished partner had been challenging, sometimes painful, but ultimately more rewarding than anything she could have imagined. And as Eleanor Blackwood sat on her mountain porch with her husband's arms around her and her children sleeping peacefully inside, she knew that every moment of struggle had been worth it to arrive at this perfect contentment. She had been dismissed as a spinster schoolmarm by those too narrow-minded to see her value. But a mountain man had looked deeper, had recognized her intelligence and strength and worth. He had proclaimed her the smartest woman there, had defended her against prejudice, had loved her without reservation. Together, they had built a life that defied convention and exceeded all expectations. That it was a love story for the ages, written not in ballrooms and fancy parlors, but in mountain cabins and frontier schoolhouses. It was a story of two people who did not fit society's molds, finding each other and creating something beautiful from their shared otherness. It was proof that true love recognizes worth regardless of societal standards, that intelligence is attractive, that independence is powerful, and that the best partnerships are built on equality and mutual respect. Eleanor's story was not the fairy tale Boston society would have written for her. No wealthy husband, no mansion, no life of ease and social climbing. But it was infinitely better because it was real, earned, chosen. It was a story of courage and determination, of refusing to accept society's verdict on her worth, of finding a man who cherished her intelligence rather than fearing it, of building a legacy that would outlast her lifetime. As the stars wheeled overhead and the mountain night embraced them, Eleanor Blackwood smiled against her husband's chest and felt nothing but gratitude for the journey that had brought her here. She had been dismissed, but she had triumphed. She had been called a spinster, but she had found profound love. She had been judged worthless, but she had proven invaluable. And she had done it all by being exactly who she was, brilliant, determined, independent, and brave. The dismissed spinster schoolmarm had become the beating heart of a frontier community, the beloved wife of an extraordinary man, the devoted mother of 3 wonderful children, and living proof that a woman's worth is determined not by her marital status, but by her character, her contributions, and her courage to live authentically. It was, Eleanor thought, as sleep began to claim her in the warm circle of Ezra's arms, the happiest of all possible endings. And also she knew with certainty the happiest of all possible beginnings, for each day with Ezra and their children was a new adventure, a new opportunity to love and learn and grow together. Their story would continue, would evolve, would face new challenges and celebrate new triumphs. But the foundation they had built of respect, love, partnership, and shared values would sustain them through whatever came. She had been dismissed as a spinster schoolmarm, but a mountain man had seen deeper, had recognized her extraordinary mind and spirit. Dur had proclaimed her the smartest woman there, and together, hand in hand and heart to heart, they had proven that love honors truth, that intelligence is beautiful, that independence is strength, and that the most unlikely partnerships can create the most extraordinary lives. And they lived happily ever after, not because their life was perfect or without challenges, but because they faced everything together, as partners, as equals, as two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed. The dismissed spinster and the mountain man, building a legacy of love, education, and courage that would echo through generations. It was the perfect ending and the perfect beginning, and everything in between.